They gathered in silence, 300 men and women, each carrying a shovel, each carrying a decision that no outsider could understand. The church called them heretics, cursed souls destined for fire. But they refused to kneel. Instead, they carved the earth open with their own hands, shaping a grave large enough to hold every one of them. Some wept, some sang, most worked with an eerie calm, as though death was no longer a threat but a doorway they had already chosen to walk through. When the pit was deep enough, they climbed inside, one by one, shoulder to shoulder. They pressed against each other in the darkness, waiting. Witnesses begged them to come back out. Soldiers offered mercy if they renounced their defiance. Not a single person moved. Then the earth rained down over their heads, thrown by their own companions, until silence was all that remained. 300 voices, buried beneath the soil, swallowed by the decision they made. But why would hundreds choose the grave over salvation? And what secret were they trying to keep from the world above? They called themselves the Forsaken Covenant, a name whispered in fear by villagers and condemned from pulpits. To the church, they were rebels against the sacred order, refusing baptism, rejecting authority, and holding secret gatherings in forests and abandoned barns. But to themselves, they were seekers of purity, bound by an oath stronger than chains, never to kneel before men who claimed to speak for God, only before the truth they believed dwelled in silence and sacrifice. The covenant's origins were ordinary, almost invisible. At first, they were farmers and tradesmen, mothers and sons, bound by whispers of dissatisfaction. The church demanded taxes beyond their means, forced oaths they did not believe, and punished even the smallest doubts with excommunication. Slowly, discontent turned into unity. They began to meet at night, far from the ears of priests, to speak words forbidden by the altar. These were not outlaws in the beginning, but desperate souls searching for meaning outside the iron walls of doctrine. Their leader was a man named Elias Veinar, remembered only in fragments. A farmer's son, but with a voice that carried like a prophet's. He spoke not of rebellion against kings or armies, but against the rot within faith itself. He claimed the church had twisted divine words into chains, and that freedom could only be found by rejecting its grip entirely. The earth is our altar, he told them. The grave is our baptism. We are reborn when we give ourselves willingly to the silence of soil. His sermons were whispered across valleys, and his name spread faster than soldiers could stamp it out. The church, alarmed, sent warnings first. Then soldiers. Fires burned their huts. Men were hanged from trees. Women dragged in chains to the city square. But persecution only deepened their resolve. Each act of cruelty seemed to prove Elias right, that the church feared not sin, but freedom. And so their gatherings grew, not dozens, not hundreds, but 300 souls bound by conviction, waiting for the moment to prove their devotion in a way no blade or noose could erase. Witnesses later claimed the covenant had begun practicing a ritual of burial long before their final act. A shallow grave dug for one, then filled to the neck with earth, leaving the head exposed. The buried would lie still for hours, praying, surrendering breath to silence. They called it the rehearsal. To them, it was not death, but preparation for transformation. The body belonged to soil, they said, but the soul passed through untouched. Outsiders who stumbled upon these rituals fled in terror, swearing they had seen corpses willingly crawl into the earth. By the time soldiers surrounded them again, 300 strong in a secluded valley, Elias made his choice. They would not run. They would not surrender. They would make the grave their sanctuary, not their punishment. Spades clanged against stone, earth split open, and a mass pit was carved with frightening precision. Villagers watching from the ridge expected panic. Instead, they saw order. Men digging while women sang low hymns. Children carrying baskets of dirt with solemn faces. It was not frenzy, it was ceremony. One soldier shouted they would all be slaughtered if they refused arrest. Elias answered calmly, "We have already buried fear. There is nothing left you can take from us." His words spread through the crowd like an incantation. People began lowering themselves into the pit, as if climbing into a bed prepared for them since birth. They did not tremble. They did not scream. They folded arms across their chests and closed their eyes, lips whispering prayers that no priest could interpret. The witnesses swore it felt less like a mass suicide than a coronation, a deliberate passage into something beyond the reach of swords and sermons. Even as the first shovels of dirt struck their faces, not one hand reached upward to resist. And when the last voice fell silent under the weight of soil, a terrible realization swept over the watchers. This was not madness. It was devotion carried to its absolute end. The church declared them damned. The villagers called them cursed. But deep down, many could not shake the question, what did those 300 see in death that made it more bearable than life under the cross of men? History books rarely mention the Forsaken Covenant by name. To the church, they were erased as quickly as they were condemned. Yet Fragments of their story survived, in letters smuggled by travelers, in the trembling recollections of soldiers who witnessed the burial, and in outlawed manuscripts copied in secret. These scraps are all we have, but together they paint a picture darker and stranger than official records dare to admit. Elias Vaynar's sermons did not end with the act of burial. They expanded into myths, carried by those who escaped capture. Rumors spread that the 300 were not truly dead, but transformed, swallowed by the earth only to rise again in some distant age. Villagers swore that the valley where they buried themselves grew barren, that no crops would grow in soil tainted by such devotion. Others said the ground itself whispered at night, as though hundreds of voices still prayed beneath the surface. The soldiers who witnessed the burial were shaken. Some deserted their posts within weeks, unable to bear the memory of 300 people lowering themselves into a grave without panic. One letter, hidden in the diary of a soldier named Marcus Heller, described it with words the church later tried to destroy. "It was no death I saw, but a passage. They welcomed the grave as a bride. I swung my shovel against the earth, but with each strike I felt I was striking against heaven itself." Heller vanished months later, and his diary passed hand to hand like contraband, fueling rumors that the covenant's devotion had left a curse upon every man who watched. The church tried to control the story. Priests preached that the covenant had been possessed by demons, that their burial was not sacrifice but suicide, and thus damnation. But the message did not hold. Too many had seen the calm on their faces, the strange peace in their movements. And so whispers grew. Whispers that perhaps the covenant had touched a truth the church feared to acknowledge. Whispers that faith might not lie in cathedrals, but in the dirt beneath their feet. Secret texts emerged decades later, believed to be copies of Elias's original writings. They spoke of a coming collapse, a time when the earth will call its children home, and only those who embrace the soil will pass unbroken. Scholars dismissed them as forgery, yet they spread nonetheless. Entire sects rose in hidden corners of Europe, imitating the covenant's rituals in smaller numbers, burying themselves in shallow graves, fasting until visions came, testing how close they could bring themselves to death without surrendering completely. To the ruling powers, these movements were dangerous infections. Dozens were arrested, some were burned, yet for every sect destroyed, another seemed to rise elsewhere. The idea was harder to kill than the people who carried it, for what the covenant had given the world was not just a death ritual, it was a question that struck at the very heart of control. If 300 could willingly climb into their grave rather than obey the church, then what power did earthly rulers truly hold over the soul? Some historians believe the covenant's burial was less an act of religious faith than of protest, a final rejection of tyranny disguised as piety. If so, it was a protest louder than any riot because it left no bodies to punish, no prisoners to torture, no leaders to execute. The people had erased themselves, leaving only silence as their rebellion. And in that silence, the church found no victory, only unease. Generations later, the story resurfaced in strange ways, in the writings of 16th century mystics who spoke of the 300 silent ones, in folklore songs that described a valley where the dead still breathed, even in children's rhymes that warned, "Don't walk too near the burial ground, or the silent ones will pull you down." The covenant had vanished from history's pages, but not from memory. Their choice haunted the edges of culture, surfacing again and again like a ghost refusing to rest. What unsettled people most was not the act itself, but the calm certainty with which it was done. It challenged the natural instinct to survive at all costs. It suggested that there were truths or loyalties stronger than breath itself, and in doing so, it forced a terrible reflection. If 300 could choose the grave willingly, then what convictions, if any, would the rest of humanity die for? The Forsaken Covenant may have been erased from official history, but their shadow never left. Their silence spoke louder than any sermon, and centuries later, that silence still lingers, demanding an answer from those who dare to remember. The silence of the covenant did not end in the grave. It seeped outward, unsettling those who lived in its shadow. Generations who grew up near the burial site treated the land with both reverence and terror. Farmers avoided plowing too deeply, convinced their plows might strike bone. Children dared each other to sleep near the pit, swearing they heard muffled cries or the faint rhythm of chanting. Though the church declared the place cursed, locals called it holy ground, the valley of the buried saints. The legacy of the covenant was not just spiritual, but political. For rulers, their act was proof of dangerous defiance. If peasants could choose death over obedience, what might others do? Laws grew harsher in surrounding regions. Attendance at Mass was made mandatory. Priests inspected households, searching for unapproved writings. Yet repression bred resistance. Those who remembered the covenant whispered of Elias Vainar, not as a madman, but as a prophet, a man who showed that freedom was worth more than survival itself. By the 15th century, the covenant story had resurfaced in underground circles of thinkers who opposed the church's authority. Secret societies copied their tale into coded manuscripts. In one, called the Testament of Soil, the 300 were described not as martyrs of faith, but as martyrs of truth, symbols of resistance against a power that claimed to own both life and soul. Reformers, centuries before Luther, pointed to their example as proof that ordinary people could defy sacred institutions and live or die by a higher conviction. The church fought back with words as sharp as swords. They called the covenant devil worshippers, deceived by false visions. Yet the very act of denial kept their story alive. The harder priests condemned, the more curiosity spread. Villagers copied fragments onto scraps of cloth, tucking them under floorboards. Traveling storytellers wove the tale into songs. Even nobles, secretly frustrated by church authority, entertained the possibility that the covenant had glimpsed a truth stripped of corruption. But perhaps the most haunting legacy came not from words, but from imitation. Across Europe, clusters of men and women recreated the ritual of earth burial. Some survived, pulled out at the last breath, trembling but ecstatic. Others were not rescued. Local records in remote villages record unexplained disappearances, whole families vanishing, their homes left intact but empty, with shovels abandoned at the door. Investigators whispered of self-dug graves in the woods, filled hastily, as if death was chosen in secret rather than forced. To some, this was madness. To others, transcendence. The line between devotion and delusion blurred. But what disturbed witnesses most was the serenity on the faces of the buried. Unlike suicides, whose deaths were marked by desperation, the covenant's imitators carried themselves with solemn joy. They were not running from life. They were walking into what they believed was a greater truth. This distinction terrified the authorities, for it made the ritual appear less like destruction and more like liberation. Elias's name returned in fragments during these centuries, reshaped by each retelling. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a heretic. To secret brotherhoods, he was the embodiment of defiance, a man who had proven that no power, not even the promise of heaven or hell, could dictate the worth of one's soul. The Valley of the Buried Saints became a destination for wanderers who carried away soil as relics, believing it carried the blessing, or curse, of those who chose silence over submission. Relics of the covenant were traded in secret markets. Jars of soil said to be from the valley fetched fortunes. Rusted shovels, discovered near abandoned farmsteads, were claimed to be tools once held by the 300 themselves. Each object became more than a curiosity. It was a fragment of resistance, proof that devotion could defy power. Monarchs feared these relics as much as priests did, for they spread an idea that rulers could not crush with laws or armies. Ideas, after all, could not be burned. Authorities cracked down. Markets were raided, manuscripts destroyed, graves dug open to prove the covenant's absence was nothing but rumor. Yet every suppression gave the story new life. Inquisitors tortured confessions out of villagers, demanding proof of sects who carried out earth baptisms. Records show peasants burned alive for refusing to deny Elias's teachings. In the Pyrenees, an entire hamlet was razed after its people were accused of recreating the ritual. And still, it spread. As one inquisitor admitted bitterly in his journals, "You may destroy the body, but the silence remains." In some regions, peasants staged small uprisings, chanting Elias's name before being slaughtered. In others, whispered sects promised that the covenant would one day return, leading the oppressed into freedom beneath the soil itself. The memory became a weapon, sharper than swords, for the mere mention of the 300 stirred fear in rulers' hearts. If people could embrace death with joy, what punishment could possibly deter them? Folklore branched into countless versions. In one telling, the 300 were said to have sunk deeper and deeper until the earth closed above them, their bodies transformed into roots that still whisper beneath the valley. In another, they did not die at all, but walked through a hidden passage into a subterranean kingdom where Elias reigns as king of the buried, waiting for the day he will call his followers to rise again. Others believed the soil itself had consumed them as payment, ensuring that their devotion fed the land for eternity. Travelers swore that when storms passed over the valley, voices rose from underground. 300 voices singing in harmony. These legends terrified monarchs and priests alike, for they kept the story alive in ways no decree could silence. And when famine, plague, or war struck, peasants once again whispered of the covenant, asking whether their ancestors had found a freedom in soil that no crown or church could offer. The covenant became less a historical event and more a recurring ghost, a reminder that obedience was not the only path, and that resistance could take the shape of silence itself. And here lies the most disturbing question. Did they truly die that day? Or did something stranger occur? Folklore insists that no bodies were ever recovered. Soldiers covered the pit, yes, but when later generations tried to unearth the site, they found nothing. No bones, no remnants of 300 lives. The church declared it a sign of divine wrath, that God himself had burned them into dust. But villagers whispered another version, that the earth had accepted them, swallowing them whole as an offering, leaving not a trace. In some tellings, the covenant were said to sleep beneath the soil, waiting for an appointed hour to rise again. This absence of bodies fueled centuries of speculation. Were they martyrs, heretics, visionaries, or something else entirely? Did Elias lead them into death or into transformation? And why has the earth kept their secret so well? It is this absence, this silence that makes their story endure, not simply because of what they did, but because of what was never found. A grave without bones is not a grave, it is a question. And that question has echoed through time, unsettling all who dare to hear it. The covenant's silence might have ended in the soil, but their shadow stretched across centuries. It was not only peasants and wanderers who kept their story alive, it was also the fearful imagination of those in power. Kings, bishops, and inquisitors invoked the covenant whenever they needed a warning, framing them as the ultimate example of what happens when belief turns against authority. Yet the more they spoke of it, the more fascination spread. In sermons, priests warned children never to speak the name Elias Venar, but whispers spread all the same, carrying the forbidden syllables across taverns, workyards, and markets. Mothers frightened their children into obedience by telling them the buried ones would rise at night to drag the disobedient underground. Yet paradoxically, the same tale was retold by rebels as a promise, that one day the silent ones would return and topple tyrants. The covenant's memory had become a weapon sharpened on both edges, a curse in one mouth and a prophecy in another. In the archives of the Inquisition, we find curious contradictions. Reports describe sects scattered across France, Italy, and the German states, groups small in number but fierce in conviction. They fasted for days, buried themselves in shallow graves until their lips turned blue, and carried dirt in pouches around their necks as tokens of devotion. Some proclaimed Elias as a saint, others as a Messiah who would awaken when the earth itself cried out for justice. Each group was hunted down, yet new ones always seemed to appear, as if the covenant's silence had seated itself in the human mind, blossoming wherever oppression grew. The strangest accounts are not found in official records, but in folklore preserved by villages. One story tells of a soldier who deserted after the burial, plagued by dreams of hands reaching from the earth. He fled across Europe, yet no matter where he went, he heard the same whispers in different tongues. In Hungary, peasants spoke of the 300 roots, buried alive to feed the soil. In Spain, they were called the sleepers beneath, waiting for God's trumpet to wake them. In Brittany, fishermen swore that storms over the valley carried voices across the sea, voices chanting prayers no priest had ever taught. Different cultures gave them different names, but the thread was always the same. They had not vanished. They were waiting. Scholars centuries later would argue whether these legends were evidence of mass trauma or of something more elusive. Perhaps the covenant story survived because it reflected the deepest human tension, our instinct to cling to life, against the terrifying possibility that true freedom lies only in surrendering it. What unsettled even the skeptics was how calmly the covenant had acted. There had been no chaos, no panic, only an eerie unity. As one historian noted, they did not resist the soil, they embraced it, and that act is more haunting than any rebellion. Yet the silence carried danger as well as fascination. Whenever the covenant was remembered, uprisings followed. In the 16th century, peasants in a remote valley of Switzerland reportedly dug a communal pit during a revolt, threatening to bury themselves alive rather than surrender. The rebellion was crushed before the ritual could be carried out, but the chronicles recorded the words shouted by their leader, "Better the earth take us than the yoke of tyrants." The shadow of Elias's teaching had risen again, centuries after his body, if it ever remained, was lost. And so the covenant lived on, not in flesh, but in echo, a silence that grew louder each time time rulers tried to bury it. What began as one grave in a valley had become an idea that defied borders, languages, and centuries. The church wanted to call it heresy, monarchs wanted to call it treason, but peasants and dreamers called it something else. Hope, a dark, unsettling hope born not from survival, but from the grave itself. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, the Covenant story should have faded into obscurity. Rational thinkers dismissed it as myth, a relic of a superstitious age. Yet the silence of the 300 continued to surface, now reshaped for a new era. Writers spoke of them not as saints or heretics, but as symbols of absolute freedom, souls who rejected every chain, even life itself. In pamphlets banned by censors, they were invoked alongside ancient rebels and philosophers, their grave reimagined as a manifesto written not with ink, but with soil. In secret salons, radicals whispered that the Covenant had discovered the ultimate rebellion, the power to choose one's end without yielding to any authority. To them, Elias Vainar was no longer a prophet of faith, but a prophet of autonomy, a man who proved that the will of the individual could surpass the will of kings and churches combined. For revolutionaries dreaming of new worlds, the Covenant was not a curse, it was a torch passed through centuries of silence. Yet not all interpretations were liberating. In some circles, the Covenant was seen as a warning of collective madness, an example of how dangerous ideas can drive communities to self-destruction. Philosophers debated whether Elias had led his people to transcendence or betrayal. Was the silence chosen freely, or was it coerced by his voice? The question haunted those who sought to untangle faith from fear. What terrified them was not knowing the answer. For if 300 had gone willingly, it meant humans could be persuaded to surrender everything, even breath itself, for a vision no one else could see. Folklore did not die with reason's rise. It adapted. Travelers spoke of dreams in which the silent ones appeared, covered in dust, their mouths filled with soil, offering warnings about the future. Sailors swore that during storms, waves carried whispers like a drowned choir. In rural villages, mothers still told children not to wander after dark, for the 300 might mistake them for stragglers and pull them beneath the ground. Though the Enlightenment tried to bury superstition, the Covenant's shadow resisted, living on in whispers that reason could not explain away. Even in the world of politics, their silence found new resonance. Revolutionaries in France compared the Bastille's prisoners to the buried saints, men swallowed by stone instead of soil. Secret clubs toasted Elias as a man who made silence louder than cannons. The irony was bitter. While the church still named him a heretic, rebels claimed him as kin. The same story that once terrified monarchs was now fueling their downfall. Silence had become speech, the grave a banner. But perhaps the most haunting transformation came in art. Painters captured visions of a valley where shadows moved beneath the soil. Poets wrote verses describing Elias's final sermon, imagining the moment when 300 souls folded into darkness without fear. And though censors tried to suppress these works, fragments always survived. Each retelling bent the story, but never broke it. The Covenant endured as a mirror, reflecting whatever each age most feared or most longed to believe about itself. By the 18th century, the 300 had become more than memory. They had become myth, endlessly reshaped, yet never erased. To skeptics, they were evidence of hysteria. To dreamers, evidence of courage. And to rulers, they were evidence of danger. For the very act of remembering them threatened obedience. 300 people had vanished into the soil, yet somehow their silence continued to speak louder than the voices of kings. And what it said, no power could control. 300 people chose the earth over the altar, silence over submission. Centuries have passed, yet their decision still echoes, unsettling those who dare to remember. What began as one mass grave in a forgotten valley has outlived kings, wars, and empires. It was supposed to end in dirt. Instead, it became an idea that no blade, no crown, no sermon could bury. The church tried to erase them. Rulers tried to brand them as cursed. But erasure has a way of sharpening memory. Each time authority pressed down, their stories seeped upward like water through cracks. They became saints to some, demons to others, and a mirror to all, reflecting what humanity most fears about itself, that we may not be bound by survival, that devotion may outstrip instinct, that silence can speak louder than all the voices of power combined. Their bodies were never found. This is the wound history cannot close. No bones, no remnants, no proof beyond whispers and records half destroyed. The earth holds its secret, as if conspiring with the Covenant to deny the world closure. And so the question festers. Did they die that day, or did they pass into something we cannot name? Each version of the story, martyrs, rebels, heretics, visionaries, fails to explain why the the earth has kept them hidden. A grave without bodies is not only a mystery, it is an accusation. We tell ourselves it was madness. We tell ourselves it was delusion. But what if it was not? What if 300 men and women truly believed they had stepped into freedom? What if their silence was not defeat but triumph? A final sermon delivered in soil rather than in words. If so, then their story is not only history, it is prophecy, waiting for another age desperate enough to listen. Look around. Even now, the world seethes with unrest. Faith in institutions cracks, trust in leaders erodes, and people search for meaning beyond the structures that bind them. How far would we go to break those chains? Would we flee? Would we fight? Or would we, like the covenant, dig our own grave and climb willingly inside, trusting that something waited on the other side? The thought is unbearable, yet that is why their silence lingers, because it dares us to ask not whether we could live as they did, but whether we could die as they did. 300 voices were swallowed by the earth, yet their echo has never stopped. It trembles in folklore, hums in rebellion, whispers through centuries. And it asks a question that no ruler, no priest, no skeptic has ever answered. What truth did they see beneath the soil that made death sweeter than obedience? Some say they sleep still, their lungs unfilled, their bodies unbroken, waiting for the moment when the world grows dark enough to call them back. Others claim they dissolved into the soil itself, feeding the land with their devotion, becoming the roots of a truth too dangerous to speak. But perhaps the most haunting possibility is the simplest, that they found nothing at all, only silence, and decided that silence was enough. Picture it again, the shovels striking earth, the pit yawning wide, the people lowering themselves one by one. No frenzy, no hesitation, only certainty, only surrender. The dirt falling, the hymns fading, the silence closing like a door. It was not an ending. It was a beginning written in soil. Perhaps we will never know. Perhaps the answer is buried forever in the valley of the buried saints. But until the earth itself gives up its secret, the silence of the covenant remains. It lingers not as an ending, but as a warning. Because if 300 souls could once choose the grave willingly, what is to stop 300 more from doing it again?